Of course, now let's move away from Uganda now into other very interesting stories. Now, over 50 years ago, selfless Canadians made history by participating in the largest non-governmental war relief effort ever. Now, this will go down in history as the hidden but incredible story of bravery and humanitarianism linking Nigeria and Canada. An award-winning filmmaker, Angela Onuora, has created an epic docu-series about the Biafran airlift, a non-governmental war relief effort, and the specific role played by Canairelief, which is led mainly by members of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, in helping save over 1 million lives.
This documentary, Operation Lights Out, the story of Canairelief, is a must-watch by all, a documentary that you must watch. Now let's take a look at it.
53 years ago, a group of daring Canadians bought a total of 5 massive Super Constellation planes and started an airline. They were not trying to make money. They risked getting shut down to fly food and medicine to starving children, all the way in southeast Nigeria, known during the war as Biafra. What happened to all 5 planes? One crashed, one was bombed on the ground, and one was flown back to Canada at the end of the war. Can you guess where the other 2 are?
Now, to shed more light on this documentary, writer, director, and producer of Operation Lights Out, the story of Canairelief documentary, Angela Onuora. Thanks for joining us. Good morning to you.
Hello, good morning.
It's a very, very interesting story, and I dare say that barely anyone remembers or has any knowledge about this at all. It's probably one of the parts of the whole Biafran war that nobody, was told about. And so, reading through it a couple of days ago, I was very, 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 fascinated by all of it. But let's get you to share with, our viewers this morning a quick history of what this was all about and how all of this started.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question very well.
So what we're trying to say is we know that this is a story, a part of history when we talk about the Biafran War that really doesn't come to light. So if you can share with us how you stumbled upon this information and, what's birthed this documentary, the journey so far.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for having me on your show. It's such an honor to be on here. I stumbled upon this story in a very serendipitous way. My father-in-law came to visit my family after we had moved to Canada 9 years ago, and he wanted to find his former high school teacher, chemistry teacher, who was Canadian, and we began to search for him, and we found out he lived only 2 hours away from us, so we drove up to go see him. And the reunion after more than 40 years for them, it was just full of stories about the war, about the relief effort. And I was like, wait a minute, what? There were Canadians in Biafra? I have to hear the story. And from the time that they shared that story with me, it just kind of stayed with me. And I became haunted by the story. And the story wouldn't let go until I told it. And that is essentially how I came across this beautiful story of humanitarianism.
It's very interesting, actually. Do you still have, relationships with some of these people? Are they still alive? Is there a lot of them that are still alive?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, we're sort of trying to find out if there are people that are still alive. We know that if we look back through the Biafran War, there are people who have survived the war, but those who, were in some way rescued by Canair, are they still alive? Have you been able to speak to a number of them?
You're asking about the survivors of the war?
Yes, and those who were. I want to ask, if Canair was able to, evacuate some of them, and if you've been able to speak to a number of them.
Oh, yes, I was very fortunate to at least get in touch with former missionaries former Canadian missionaries to Nigeria, and many of them served in the southeast before it became Biafra. And a lot of them as well, even after Biafra, the war started, found a way to come back into Biafra to help starving children and people and help distribute medicines. So there were still Canadians and other nationals in Biafra at that time. So I was able to find some of them and interview them. Unfortunately, a few of them have passed away during the course of making the film, but I was fortunate to find the last surviving pilot of Canairelief. It's unfortunate that most of them have died off. It's just the one person left. And from what he told me, I was the first person to interview him since the war ended. After they came back to Canada, they didn't get any kind of press debriefing or any interviews. They didn't get any bells and whistles, even some kind of acknowledgement for putting their lives on the line to save people. They just went right back to work and nothing happened. So me interviewing him was the first time he was getting interviewed in over 50 years. So it was a bittersweet story in terms of finally they get to tell their stories, but it really took too long.
I mean, you mentioned having just spoken to the last surviving pilot. I did see somewhere where we had about 17 pilots that unfortunately lost their lives. Correct me if I'm wrong. Can you share with us some of the downsides? I mean, one plane was shot on the ground.
Yeah.
Share with us some of the challenges.
Crashed also.
Yeah, another plane crash. Share with us some of the challenges that the airline experienced in the course of trying to give relief to Nigeria during the Biafra War.
Yes. So it was a very dangerous mission for them, and which is why it's such a wonderful story, an overdue homage for these men who put their lives on the line. Because first of all, flying into Biafra, Nigeria, the Nigerian government at the time had made it clear to the relief effort, to the relief organizations, that flying into Biafra was a violation of their airspace. There was a civil war going on, but because hunger had been used as a weapon of warfare, they said to the Nigerian government, we're not going to sit back and watch you starve people to death. And they flew food in regardless. So they had bombers on the ground trying to shoot them down. Then they had fighter jets in the air trying to shoot the planes down. In fact, they were waiting for the planes to land so they could bomb them on the ground. And so many planes were destroyed this way. Many planes were bombed on the ground. Some planes were shot down. And then in the case of the Biafran plane that crashed and killed 4 Canadians, I think there are many reasons why they felt that plane crashed. There was the mindset that they overshot the runway, and they feel like the Nigerian government placed a false beacon that made them overshoot the runway. And then when they were trying to make a U-turn, almost like turn back and then flying, they ran into a tree on a hill, and that caused the crash for the Canadians. It came with such risks, and there are people who were still willing, and the Canadians particularly, even when the Americans and the Europeans were not willing to fly because of how dangerous it was, given how many planes were shot down and bombed on the ground. The Canadians were fearless enough to continue flying, and because of many reasons. One was because they had the biggest planes. They understood that each plane fed over 200,000 people per flight. So they understood the impact of their flight, and they were willing to risk their lives. So such a wonderful story.
Yes, it is. I want to ask about, what do you hope this documentary will achieve? What story do you think it will be able to tell? And what really can it achieve if there's more and more people watching it?
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't hear what you said. The sound is.
All it can help.
So what do you hope to achieve by telling this story? What's the end goal for you?
Okay. There are many things I set out to achieve. One is to tell a story that has been long overdue. It's part of Canadian and Nigerian history. For me, I'm trying to tell a story of how Nigeria and Canada, both my home and adopted countries, have always been related since before independence, and have had a very good relationship all these decades. Many people don't know about it. I think the only time that Canada has come up on the radar for Nigerians is the recent immigration influx. But before then, Canada and Nigeria has always had a long-standing good relationship. They've helped build schools, churches, hospitals that I didn't know about. And I wanted to tell this to Nigerians who didn't know, to also understand a deeper connection between the two countries, and also tell the story about how the war started and how bad the war was, because I feel like in this day and age, people romanticize war because they didn't see it. If we talk to the generation that saw the war, all of them have a unanimous answer: never again. Ozoemena, no more, never again. But I find that it seems like it's such an easy, loose term to use. Oh, we're going to go back, we're going to do this again. No, because nobody's coming, and that's the truth. This was a one-time thing where, just off of the heels of the Second World War and chasing right after the Vietnam War, and seeing all these Biafran children on television, the world was moved to do something. Look at what's happening around the world right now. The world has become inundated with wars. There's conflict everywhere. Nobody is coming. So if we make the mistake of repeating this mistake of going to war again against ourselves, nobody's coming to save anybody. So it will be a complete disaster, and history must never repeat itself. That's that's the biggest, strongest reason that I decided to tell the story, and also to give a voice to the millions of children who died not knowing why they died. There's been no reconciliation. There's been no day of remembrance to remember the dead. These are the things that we should be looking at instead of trying to think about conflict with one another. Those are my reasons.
And that's a very valid reason you've highlighted there. If we look at Rwanda, for example, it's one thing that they hold so dearly. The Rwandan genocide is something that they'd always talk about. It's why you'd always visit the memorial center. Now let's talk about your use of art. You were very particular about using art in telling this story. Why was that, and how easy was it for you to be able to access clips in terms of videos, photos, or maybe newspapers to be able to tell your story?
Yes, I had a lot of help. That's actually a very important question. I had a lot of help. The Canadian government was very magnanimous in terms of funding this film. I unfortunately wasn't able to raise funding from Nigeria because, we all know that there isn't quite a lot of that, and the story is still very touchy. But at home here in Canada, I was able to raise funding both on the regional level, provincial level, and federal level. I got funding. And then Dan Church Aid, I think I owe a huge thanks to them more than many people, because they were willing to give me raw footage that they shot during that time. They heard about the film being made and they were so intrigued and really interested in supporting this film. And so they gave me free footage to use. I was able to also use art, because there's some footage that you can't really, telling the story of the pogroms and how it affected people. It's not something, there's barely any footage from the pogrom. So I had to use art, and art became a very valuable part of telling the story, to make it more engaging, make it more, try to almost not be so visceral with the violence. So, there are so many things I had to come into play, but I had a lot of support, and I'm really grateful for all of them.
I want to know if you expect that there would be some pushback, because, like you said, these are conversations that haven't been had much, since the war ended in 1970. There's, almost some stigma around the word Biafra. When you talk about any part of it in Nigeria today, there's some, stigma around it. So do you think that the documentary will also maybe get the same reaction from people? Or, is there a way that you expect that more people will be willing to watch and listen and, just learn more about what happened in those times?
If I heard you correctly, you're talking about pushback on the film?
Yes.
Yes, I do. I did going into the film. I know that there was going to be pushback on some level because it's the Biafran subject. But I wanted to be, and then also being Igbo, I was very deliberate about how I told the story. I wasn't trying to tell the story in an inflammatory way, because that would defeat the purpose. My biggest lesson for this, that I want Nigerians and anyone who watches this film, particularly Nigerians, is to learn a bit about their history, to kind of inspire a curiosity and thirst for our history, to go and learn the history and not learn the history from the point of view of bias. So I came from this story from the angle of a storyteller and a historian. I'm not a historian per se. I had to hire experts to help me bring forth the facts and fact check. It was such a huge thing because I don't want to tell a story that I can't back up. So it was important for me to fact check everything I said there, and then tell the story from a point of view of this is what happened. It's not about whose fault it was or pointing fingers at anybody. It's more about telling this generation who don't know anything about the war, growing up, going to school in Nigeria, it was skipped over. The war was skipped over in history. And so I feel like this is an opportunity for us, for me particularly as a filmmaker, to tell the story in a way that brings all sides together to learn about our history and decide.
Right. It's absolutely important, that we tell a story about our history. Any country that must go forward must always look back to where it's coming from. There's so many angles to this conversation we'd love to explore, but unfortunately we've run out of time. Thank you, Angela, for joining us this morning. So much. And I wish you all the best with the documentary. We hear it's out on the 30th of May.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a wonderful day.